Yep, we're doing this again. Welcome everyone to this year's Halloween special, but first a recap. In 2014 and 15 I reviewed a couple of Thomas fan films. They were off the rails and stirred up some emotions in me I'd buried for years. This was also an interesting time for the official series that continues to air, and I already uploaded another video the other day as a primer for this one about the fluctuating state of the series quality. If you want my full thoughts on the recent changes, I'll provide a link in the description. It makes the subject of today so interesting to me, the timing of its recent release, how we've looped back around to where we were just before I made those older reviews. I was so hopeful back then. The series in its current state isn't making me with nerd rage, but I need a distraction from this drivel. Let's see what the fans are up to.
I don't even want to tell you what they found in the toilets.
Oh. Right. There's a reason I decided to split this up and make that whole critique its own separate video. If you have any kids present, or are a child yourself, close this tab right now. This is going to get gruesome. I don't just mean unpleasant imagery, I mean unpleasant subject matter. Stuff that damn near ruined my day. This is your last chance to tune out if you think this will be too much for you. For those who weren't around to see Paul's vids Shed 17 with us, that was a fan-made horror film where the engines are revealed to be biofused humans. There's a lot of gore as the characters literally come apart at the seams in numerous creative ways, and it all ends with Thomas so traumatized he tears off his own face in a fit of rage. Happy Halloween. So yeah, a few years later and the long-awaited sequel is here, and it promises to be even darker, more gory and visceral, and just more depraved than Shed 17 was at its A-game. So much that he actually had to remove a scene and re-upload this because it violated YouTube's guidelines. Behold, Project G-1. For those wondering why I'd be okay with this story's lack of realism and characters being out of character after ranting about the official series the other day, that's just it. This is a fan fiction, specifically one that doesn't have any pretense of acting as a substitute for the real thing. It's its own wildly different thing that completely owns what it is. When something does try to feel like a more traditional story but still goes all over the place, that's the fine line I have trouble standing on. But this, I can easily separate in my mind from the things I grew up with. Whether or not you can will depend. The sequel picks up inside Shed 17 itself, with Thomas's empty metal shell. We finally get a good look at what was inside the tube that made him literally jump from his skin, and the cameraman seems to be coping pretty well. I like when scary movies do this. Contracted Phase 2 is a good example, picking up the very minute the first movie ends, so it's like one long movie. Oh god, it's a Zaby! The world now knows all about the horrors that went down on the island thanks to Keith the Whistleblower from the first film, who continues to spread the word even as the average Joe and the media try to pin this all on him as if he was the mastermind behind the horrors. We see the world's response to the truth, as many Thomas fans were irreparably traumatized. Like in real life, no doubt. We even get a nice dig at disingenuously over-the-top react channels. And instead of continuing to retch in every interview, Keith decides to change it up this time. As overplayed as scenes like this are, these characters losing their minds as they see what their insides are really like is a smart move. It's easy to not be horrified when you don't have to look inside your own guts, but we're all ugly on the inside.
I worked closely on the television series in the early 80s, so I was around the engines at all times.
I think you know who this guy is. He appears a few times and the way it's done is pretty smart. If the Beatles logo was revealed right away, it'd ruin the joke, but since it's out of frame the first few times they show him, it gives people a chance to catch on to the joke on their own.
Trucks, particularly the faceless ones, rarely had the brain capacity to retain long-term memory.
Not to be nitpicky, but how are they supposed to fit any cargo in there? Like, what's the utility of this? What's the point? I guess it's just some sick punishment. Eh, well, I'm sure nothing will come of this.
I can't imagine a worse hell than being a truck.
As the window closes on them, some engines flee to other countries to start a new life, only to lose any rights they had left.
They both knew this was a battle to the death, so they had to put their friendship aside. There was only one way to survive.
As silly as this whole scene is, I do think there's something weirdly poignant about these former humans getting some of their humanity back, only to be forced to use their regained arms in such horrific ways. The only thing I really hate about this scene is how the Japanese are characterized. They all have the same scary looking slanty eyes. I'll cross my fingers and say Paul wasn't trying to make Japanese people look evil, but the assets used in the scene do unfortunately kinda create that effect. And is that Wolverine? Huh. Actually not out of place here.
Hit Logistics was the military contractor secretly tasked with continuing the work Sodor research had begun.
Oh, that is good.
The first task.
You know, what is that thing behind Keith? It appears in just about every shot he's in, I think. He stands next to it the whole time. Huh. And hey, look who else is back from Shed 17.
Deep in secret government research. His biggest dream was much more sinister.
As if tampering with DNA to fuse it with machines wasn't freaky enough, his real goal with Project G-1 is to break them down further, basically into cellular mush they can remold into any sort of bioweapon they can think of. Not sure what their beef with Australia is, but this is giving me strong The Thing vibes.
To maintain the secrecy of these illegal experiments, the soldiers' faces would be covered up, so that the only giveaway was a cry of discomfort when a vehicle was damaged or a tank shell was fired.
Okay, that's pretty funny. I prefer this more restrained humor personally. He takes a particular interest in the sometimes accidental creation of twins, one person being broken into two. It goes as well as you might expect.
I like pizza. I like it.
The twins have a strong empathic link, being two halves of one person originally. Whatever pain one suffers, the other not only experiences a sensation of, but the effects. If one is crushed to death or burned alive, the other will crumple or burst into flames, no matter how far away or what's between them. In light of ever-mounting legal pressure, the powers that be begin to wipe out the biofused characters, destroying the evidence, leading to a particularly unpleasant scene.
What's the matter? Stay with me.
Oh, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the needlessly drawn-out next scene where Diesel has to run over his wife's still crispy husk. Ugh. Come to think of it, doesn't Diesel's continued existence contradict the first film's assertion that Diesel's just burn up inside? The remains of the destroyed engines are dumped into a quarry, never to be seen again. And here we see a new side of the engine's suffering. We've seen plenty of loco carnage, but how about loco addiction? You heard me right. Ugh, this actually does make me uncomfortable. These edits are pretty clean, and that just makes them more effectively disturbing. As if the engines didn't have enough to worry about with people trying to kill them. Some of the human staff are steamies. Train enthusiasts who came to work on the island to get a closer look at the engines and take things a little too far.
James was a favourite engine. Sometimes every night for weeks, they'd gather at the turntable and play Spin the Engine.
Oh, thank goodness that's all they did. I thought they were gonna molest him. I mean, I guess they kinda did.
James's driver and fireman were feeling him all over.
Dagnabbit.
But I had nothing to do with any of that business. Not after the first time.
Actually, that exact thing does happen in the original version of the film.
With the advent of the dark web, Steamies could now safely connect online, sharing their sick fantasies.
But Smudger wasn't a fantasy.
Some steamies tracked down the abandoned Smudger, broke into his shed, and it's clear what they were doing. I feel like I need mouthwash just talking about this. There's a reason the film's a minute shorter now, but hey, I'm sure it can't get any worse than that.
No, please, wait, no, please, no, oh God, no, no!
With the seeds of revolution planted long before and having suffered enough of this unending cruelty, humans and vehicles alike march upon HIT's main laboratory. Despite heavy losses on the protesters' side, things seem to be going well, until G-1 itself is accidentally unleashed. The monster that emerges is actually not a bad design. It's basically Gordon and a bunch of other dead engines merged together, walking like a spider with giant skeletal limbs. Gordon's sharp, stern face always did lend itself very well to meanness. The more humans and engines G1 consumes, the bigger and hungrier it gets. Like I said, I get the Thing vibes from this production. Assuming there isn't going to be another sequel, this works as a final boss for the two films together. It makes for the quarry to join with the rest of the remains buried there and become unstoppable. Gosh, I'm a sucker for this kind of imagery. Some huge, hulking, monstrous yet still vulnerable and incomplete thing looking for the rest of itself to become perfect. Instead, it finds another piece of what was missing.
After 28 operations to try and reconstruct him as a human being, he had remained behind closed doors, unwilling until now to show the world the monster he had become.
That wasn't the Thomas I knew. That wasn't an engine or a unit.
You're standing right next to him, dude.
On the remains of his friends. His friends had found him.
Hidden in full view, and now used as a weapon.
Makes as much sense as anything else, I guess. And so the nightmare ends. With the death of G1, all of the dead engines put to rest, the world can move on. Sodorland is made its own sovereign nation, exclusively for any engines that remain. No human ever setting foot on the island again, as Thomas is left to grieve. I gotta say, this ending is pretty good. It ups the stakes while bringing it all in and ending things in a surprisingly quiet, intimate way. And leaving Thomas out for most of this and bringing him in at the last second is a surprisingly good move. Though I gotta say, as gruesome as this whole affair was, as much as it managed to disgust me, it didn't blow me away with some big reveal at the end. But I guess that's a pretty tall order given how bananas the first was. They can just glue him back together, right?
Relax, Mr. Hartley. You are in our capable hands now.
Alright, I take back what I said. This is a nice way to mirror Shed 17's ending. Seeing things from the other side of the glass literally gives you a new slant on things. But then, if that wasn't enough...
You're among friends here. This is where everyone ends up. Once they've become troublesome.
Okay, that is a hell of a twist ending. Like, that is some next level horror. Given how prominent he is in both films, Keith is arguably the protagonist, the main character, the one we can most easily identify with, someone whose observations and reactions to the horror we can see ourselves displaying, to a degree. So to see him, or rather us, get the bad ending, arguably the worst fate imaginable, the very place he never imagined himself in, is just a shot in the arm the story needed. Heck, this film's good at foreshadowing in general. No one will recognize him, no one will hear him or come to rescue him. He will rot and die, alone, empty, and miserable. He has no mouth, and he must scream. It even elevates the first film. Now when I watch that and see Keith open his mouth, I'll know he eventually winds up here. It really changes how you watch these. In this final scene, 51 years from now, some kids try to break into Sodaland and are thrown out by Diesel 10. Now, this character has always been really dumb. Just the concept of a diesel with a giant evil claw in it is one of the first turns the official series took for the weird and fantastical. But in this context, it's actually a pretty clever use of the character, implying that the engines of the future have only grown more advanced, more evolved and lifelike, and more deranged in mankind's absence on the island. Maybe they'll declare war on humanity someday for revenge. Who knows? Maybe Keith's still there. I really like this remix. Project G1, at first, seems like more of the same, but it does what a good sequel should. It takes concepts introduced in Shed 17, utterly illogical concepts, to their logical conclusion. While Shed 17 was about blowing the lid on a conspiracy, about getting the word out, this was about going back in, the chickens coming home to roost. It cleans up the mess the rather open-ended first film left for it, which I understand is exactly what some fans dislike about it. Sometimes it's fun to leave things more open, fill in the blanks with your own mind. But just when you think you know where G-1 is going, it doubles down and reaches into places I didn't think it could. I normally don't like everything being explained, since our imaginations tend to make things even scarier than they eventually turn out to be, because the reveals are more often than not rather disappointing. But I'm not the least bit disappointed with the reveals this time. I think Paul did a good job upping the ante without going too far. With the exception of one scene. I mean, make no mistake, he went too far when he began this. This is all dumb as crap. But he made it a good watch. The animation and cinematography are better, the scares themselves are great stuff. That said, I don't think the editing was quite as tight. There's something almost magic about how Shed 17 was paced, how many crazy moments it packed together and so cleanly. That kind of flow is difficult to recapture, and G1 does feel slightly more drawn out. I mean, even apart from the runtime. There's a lot I didn't show because I don't want this review to become a substitute for the project. Again, I don't recommend it to kids, or people who can't take horror, even this wackier sort. But if you're in the mood for something different this Halloween, and you think you have the stomach for this, why not give it a go? Given his track record, I know if Paul does anything like this going forward, well, I just gotta watch it now. Still, who knows if I'll ever make a video like this again. Thank you for sticking around this long. Now if you'll excuse me, I've had Thomas on the brain for a week while putting these last two videos together, and I need him out, so don't expect this to become a trend. If you want to support my work, please consider my graphic novel series, Planet Ripple. You can buy the books on Amazon and or read an older draft of the first volume for free in my DA gallery. Links to everything in the description. Doodles!